So today we're going to be doing the Haitian Revolution, the series from Extra History. It's a six-parter, so buckle in. It should be a good time. I'm really excited about it. The Haitian Revolution is just another product of the kind of age of revolution that was the late 1700s, early 1800s. We have a lot of revolution going around. It's in a large way kicked off by the American Revolution, which created a lot of the language that would be present in a lot of later revolutions. The French Revolution borrowed heavily from a lot of American writers and idealists, and a lot of people that they were inspired by also inspired the thought of the French Revolution. So then we have the Haitian Revolution, which is a place that was under French control. It was a slave colony. The Sugar Islands were incredibly brutal. And this is another case of that. It's a case of anti-imperialism, but does it become this sort of modern democratic society where everybody's equal or whatever? Well, no, it doesn't really. That is one of those things. When you look at a revolution, you think, okay, is this like a revolution to change or a revolution to preserve? The American Revolution was a revolution to preserve, weirdly enough. Americans had grown accustomed to a certain way of life as English colonies, and they felt that the British imperial forces were trying to take away their, and I've been using this word a lot today, their agency and their ability to self-govern and all that. They felt like the British were overstepping their boundaries and trying to get in the way of this new, I guess, this American lifestyle that they'd become so accustomed to, that they were allowed to become accustomed to because they were so distant from their colonial masters. Then there's the French Revolution, and that was to change things. That was to overthrow the existing order. The Americans wanted to just continue going on as they did. The French, they wanted to change things and make things better. What was the Haitian Revolution? In a lot of ways, it felt like it was going to be the latter, where it was going to try to change things, but it actually kept a lot of the slave infrastructure in place and kind of just put some black people at the top of the pyramid in a lot of ways. Like, I only know so much about the Haitian Revolution, so the nitty-gritty is going to be very new to me, but like, big picture, it is a much more conservative revolution than you would think. So let's get started. Let's see what they got.
Saint-Domingue, 1791.
Saint-Domingue.
Only a year before, the man had been a warrior in the Congo. Captured by his enemies, he was sold into slavery, crammed into a festering ship's hold. More than 1 out of every 7 captives taken died before they ever saw western shores. But he's one of the lucky ones. He at last makes it to the plantation, where he will likely die. He learns this from one of the few enslaved men who speaks his language. They will be raising sugarcane, a dangerous and exhausting task, with the harvest season lasting from December to July. Half the new arrivals.
So that is one of the things about working in the Sugar Islands. You were more likely to be worked to death the further south you went. The closer to the equator you got, the conditions just got a little bit worse. There is kind of a gulf between the quality of life as an enslaved person on the American mainland versus the quality of life on one of these islands. It's still bad regardless, but I don't think I can emphasize enough how poor the quality of life would have been for those who were unfortunate enough to end up on a sugar island.
Will die of disease before the year is out. And if they try to escape, they face punishments ranging from whipping to amputation. The men who harvest the cane have cuts all over their bodies. The women who process it are missing arms from the crushing machines or have massive burns from the boiling vats of sugar. The death rates are so high, his guide says. Plantation owners don't bother providing food or clothing. They just buy more enslaved people when the current group is worked to death. But not for much longer, he says. It is good this new arrival is a warrior, because they have use for warriors. there's going to be a revolution.
Nice.
The Haitian Revolution is a unique event, both an offshoot of the French Revolution and an anti-colonial struggle. Haiti would become the second American nation to successfully win independence. And it remains, to this day, history's only example of enslaved people successfully rising up against their oppressors. And
one thing that I always take out of the Haitian Revolution is the response to it from the American mainland, because Americans were upholding their current system, which involved upholding slavery where it was still there. Of course, plenty of free states are established. Plenty of states go on to abolish slavery within their borders. But overall, America as an entity upheld the slave order. So seeing a bunch of black people overthrowing their European masters was kind of scary to people who were keeping their own enslaved people. It kind of made them fear what would happen if something like that happened here. Like, would we be... And it makes them want to really clamp down and ensure that they have a strong control over their own people. It's really interesting how the Southern plantation owner responds to this sort of thing. Like Thomas Jefferson, I've talked about this in the past. It seemed as if he has never seen a revolution he didn't like, but he wasn't fond of this one. First of all, he was fond of the French, and this is a revolution against the French. But also, I'm sure he looks at a bunch of black enslaved people rising up and sees himself more in the people who are being risen up against than in the actual people who are performing the revolutionary action.
An act that stunned the world and reshuffled the political order. From inspiring movements in other colonies to forcing Napoleon to sell Louisiana to the United States, its effect would be profound. But there is no good ending for the people that fought and died to create the world's first government led by liberated slaves. For the example of Haiti's revolution, including the violence of its rising, caused other nations to do everything they could to weaken the young government. Policies that, 200 years later, still impact Haiti and contribute to its current difficulties. But the roots of that instability were there from the beginning, because the economy of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, later known as Haiti, was largely devoted to a single plant. In Saint-Domingue, sugar was king. French settlers arrived on the island of Hispaniola via Caribbean piracy. And though the island had been Columbus's first landing place in the Americas, after a century as a Spanish colony, it was neglected and sparsely populated. By 1625, French pirates had begun setting up agricultural settlements on the western side, importing large numbers of African slaves. By 1697, the division was official, splitting Hispaniola into the French Saint-Domingue in the west and the Spanish Santo Domingo in the east. And within 50 years, Saint-Domingue was a crucial part of the Atlantic trade. Because Saint-Domingue, as it turned out, was the ideal place to grow three products that Europe and its North American colonies couldn't get enough of. The first was indigo, a plant that produced a rich blue dye. Next was coffee, the beverage of choice during the Enlightenment. But mostly, it was sugar, a substance Europeans couldn't get enough of, whether raw or converted to rum. And
yeah, sugar, like before sugar, like one of the more popular sweeteners would have been honey. But sugar took off rather quickly, and coffee being huge during the Enlightenment, that there's just a rich tradition of Enlightenment debate accompanied by coffee. That you'll find that if you study the Enlightenment. So that's really fun to learn about. So it's incredibly tragic when you see the other side of that, especially when so many Enlightenment thinkers are benefiting off of these cruel working conditions. A lot of the Enlightenment thinkers will bring up a lot of anti-slavery ideas, or at least the ideas that would inspire anti-slavery sentiment. But they are benefiting immensely from these products that are basically pulled from the exploitation.
The tiny colony of Saint-Domingue produced about half of the coffee and sugar consumed in Europe. It was by far the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, if not the world, and the jewel of France's imperial crown. In fact, 1 in every 25 Frenchmen had a job supported by the Saint-Domingue trade. But there was trouble underneath the surface of this economic powerhouse, because Saint-Domingue was a slave society. A place that didn't just have slavery, but was structured entirely around the bloody institution. And the different classes of people living in the colony all had different and overlapping grievances that would all explode once the burning fuse of revolution moved from America to France to the island itself. So when the revolution exploded in Saint-Domingue, it was not a single revolt, but multiple different risings focused on different issues, as much a civil war as a popular uprising. Now, this gets really complicated and nuanced fast, but
I'm glad that he lays this out so well, because it would be very easy to lump too broad a group of Haitian people together, or would-be Haitians together, as if they all believe the same thing. And I think that's something that we tackle a lot in American history when talking about our revolution. We try to be very careful not to say that everybody was for the revolution, because that's not necessarily the case, or that everybody was on the same page when it came to how to conduct the revolution or how to deal with what they perceived as British imperial overreach. So it is cool that it's kind of breaking down the fact that there are different sort of rebel groups that are popping up with different intentions, and depending on who ends up benefiting the most from this, we could get very different systems.
But to understand what's going to happen, we have to give you a rundown of how society on Saint-Domingue stood in the 1780s, right as revolution was starting to brew in Paris. So, we're going to look at 3 parts of Saint-Domingue's population: the whites, the free people of color, and the enslaved. The white plantation owners, known as the Big Whites, lived in huge estates. The city of Le Cap in the colony's north looked a little like Paris, with street grids and a massive theater. Their sons and daughters dressed in the most current fashions, and read newspapers brought daily from Paris. In fact, many of these Big Whites didn't even live in Saint-Domingue, preferring rather to hold court in huge estates in France, while others managed their land and finances. Though rich, the Big Whites chafed under French economic policies, which forbade them from diversifying the local economy or selling their product to any place but France, even though British Barbados and America wanted their goods. And as the American colonies rose up, these Big Whites found themselves identifying with revolutionary plantation owners like Washington and Jefferson, and began to wonder if they too could win more economic freedom with a similar Declaration of Independence. Below
There we go. It's the revolution in a lot of ways, not just the Haitian Revolution. The American Revolution was a revolution built somewhat around ideas, largely around commerce. There's the issue of Western expansion that has a financial element to it. There's the issue of the East India Company having a monopoly on tea. That's in a huge economic sanction on the American colonies. Like you can approach it from a purely economic standpoint and get a huge picture of the American Revolution. Not the whole thing, but like if you take out like the frilly language or whatever, there's still plenty to chew on when it comes to the American Revolution. And I'm going to be comparing this to the American Revolution and French Revolution a lot because of its unique space in relation to those two. I think this can help us understand the American and French revolutions just as much as we could learn from studying any of those in a bubble. There's plenty to learn from the revolutions inspired by the revolution, inspired by the revolution.
these Big Whites were these so-called Little Whites, Frenchmen who arrived trying to make enough money so that they could go home rich. They were the bookkeepers, the plantation overseers, or shopkeepers. They, in other words, fulfilled any job that did not require physical labor. These Little Whites resented the Big Whites for their money and power, looked down on the enslaved as inferior, and considered the colony's free people of color, often richer and better educated, as economic rivals. The free people of color require a bit of explanation, as they were a fairly unique class to the Caribbean. In the early days of the colony, men outnumbered women heavily, and there were few female colonists. This led to a large number of French men having coerced or violently forced relations with female slaves. In some cases, these French men freed and married the women or freed the resulting children. Over time, this created a class of people known as the free people of color, who became a distinct economic force. You see, under the laws of France, the free people of color were not equal. They couldn't vote, for instance, but they could hold land and inherit property. And unlike the little whites, who were...
That's still... I'm not saying that's a good deal, but relative to how they would be treated in other places, that's not the worst deal they possibly could have gotten. Just, yeah, they can't vote, and that's awful. But it's actually surprising how much they were allowed, given how terrible the conditions could be on the American mainland. Like, there was actually a little bit of room, not at the top for them, but there was some room, like, a little higher up for them, which the Americans did their very best to stomp out on the mainland.
Always taking their earnings back to France. The free people of color stayed put and built multi-generational fortunes. As a result, many prospered, often coming to own plantations with their own enslaved workforce. Indeed, new arrivals to the colony from France often
And how could they do that? They have the same skin color. But this is like how we... like, they may not have thought of themselves as the same thing just because they have the same skin color as the enslaved people. They might have had their own... like, people aren't just driven by one element of their identity. This is a big part of something called cultural history, where it's all about how people make sense of themselves and the world around them. And they often do so by developing different identities. There's your ethnic or racial identity, which could correlate with your skin or where you're from. There's your class identity, which certainly impacts this. So they might be basing this decision more on their class identity. And then there's other concepts that are slightly more modern, like gender identity, ideas of masculinity and femininity and that sort of stuff. And that's kind of the approach that cultural historians take to stuff like this. They would say that this isn't just a racial, ethnic thing. This isn't just based on skin color. There's probably an element of class there.
Crossed the color line to marry into this group due to their wealth and local connections. Like the big whites, they dressed in French fashion, or at least they did, until a series of racist apartheid laws, championed by the little whites and sweeping in after an aborted 1758 slave revolt, came into force. These new laws barred them from public office, disallowed wearing European-style clothes, and restricted where they could live. Official documents had to indicate that they were colored, since many of these people of color might only have one black grandparent and could easily pass for white. And bizarre charts tracked blood quantum to figure out exactly how black someone was. With a fairer system still within living memory, the free people of color would see the French Revolution as an opportunity to gain legal equality as citizens.
So I'm curious about, like, the degree, like, where they break down, like, these degrees of blackness or whiteness. I would love to go deeper into that. Because I don't have a full understanding of how they broke it down there. Like, Americans, eventually we started, like, moving towards the idea of, like, one drop and then you're black. Like, you might have, like, one black grandparent, you might look completely white, but, like, you are fully black at that point. You can't be white because you got one drop. Same thing happened in a lot of mixed race, black and white people had plantations. Yeah. Louisiana is an interesting case. Among the mainland American locations, that is a much bigger outlier than a lot of other places. That deserves its own conversation.
Pass for white. And bizarre charts tracked blood quantum to figure out exactly how black someone was. With a fairer system still within living memory, the free people of color would see the French Revolution as an opportunity to gain legal equality as citizens. Though don't mistake that for abolitionism. They often saw themselves as separate from the recently arrived enslaved and opposed the idea of emancipation. And then,
Like the caste system, yeah.
a group that outnumbered
Kind
all
of.
the other groups 10 to 1. And a
Almost
population
exactly.
that died so fast due to disease, mistreatment, and the tortures of forced labor that a third of all enslaved people kidnapped from Africa went to Saint-Domingue. Recently arrived from different areas, they spoke a common French Creole and developed Vodou, a system of religious beliefs that melded African religious elements with Catholicism. And while any open resistance was put down with violent punishments, including being thrown into boiling sugar, eaten alive by insects, or blown up with gunpowder, the enslaved developed other methods of economic sabotage. In some cases, they might go on strike, disappearing until a particularly cruel overseer was fired, and groups of escaped slaves known as Maroons lived in the mountains, raiding plantations for supplies and carrying out guerrilla warfare. But there were also more everyday forms of resistance: slow work, faking illness, or pretending not to understand tasks. Tactics that proved so effective that the colony's white population were thoroughly convinced that the enslaved were stupid and lazy. An attitude that caused them to fatally underestimate the threat when the revolution came, and the battered enslaved turned their machetes to a different use. Because while there were divisions in class, even among the enslaved, they did have a unifying cause. They wanted freedom, and to put the plantations to the torch.
My mixed ancestors in Texas owned some slaves. I'm not saying that people in America did not ever own slaves, like at all. It's if they were like mixed or black or whatever. But there are a lot of regulations that made it more difficult for black people to own slaves or whatever. It's complicated. I feel like I'm not smart enough to do it all off the top of my head. I would have brought notes if I knew I was going to be going into this, because it's detailed, very detailed.
Thanks to our educational tier patrons Ahmed Ziad Turk, Joseph Blaine, and Dominic.
Let's continue on.
Paris, August
The long
26th.
fuse. Like that first episode, that is the thing I've noticed with a lot of these slightly newer ones, like the ones with this narrator. They feel like that felt like more than just one episode. That felt long. Maybe it's because I had a lot to say. As an introduction, with it laying down the context so well, I really enjoyed commenting on it. So maybe I'll be a little bit more out of my depth the further on we go.
1789. The Revolutionary National Assembly in France takes the vote. At issue is a new document, drafted by Marquis de Lafayette in consultation with his friend Thomas Jefferson. But in truth, many statesmen have
Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It borrows from the Magna Carta, the American Declaration of Independence, and both the English and American Bill of Rights. It begins. Article 1. Men are born and remain free and in equal rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good. Though they do not know it, these words will light a fuse that will burn all the way across the Atlantic and blow the slave society of Saint-Domingue to smithereens.
Yeah, so Thomas Jefferson, he had a role in a lot of French revolutionary circles as well. Like, it's really interesting how deep his claws ran in world revolutionary thought. Like, and his ideas are going to be quoted, or the way he has articulated these old Enlightenment thoughts is going to be present in some of the most major revolutions going forward, like going all the way up to Vietnam. I love bringing this up, but Ho Chi Minh basically quoted Thomas Jefferson back to the Americans in their own sort of declaration, which is really interesting, and you would think would speak to the Americans, speak to our sentiments around such things, but We did not see like our founders in like Ho Chi Minh. Something was difficult for ordinary people to make that connection, even though it was, there are clearly the parallels there.
Like the American Revolution, slavery was always lurking under the table in revolutionary France. It did not go unnoticed that the revolution's rallying cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity was directly at odds with slave-owning society. But there were also no illusions about the French dependency on the sugar economy of Saint-Domingue. And though abolition was discussed from the mid-1700s, even the most radical favored a gradual emancipation, with slave owners being paid compensation. Many warned that if nothing changed, a major Caribbean slave revolt was inevitable. Then when the revolution came, representatives from the big whites, the Saint-Domingue plantation owners, and the free people of color both decided that the time had come to take their goals to Paris. The big whites pushed for the colonies to have seats in the newly created National Assembly, so they could argue for more autonomy in the colonies' affairs, and for the freedom to trade with the British Caribbean and the United States. And the free people of color.
And they would want, like, in the United States, even though we were more closely aligned with France militarily at our founding, we were more aligned with the British based on their trade power. And generally, the British were the ones you wanted to trade with. There were cool things about France, but as far as like the strongest trade power goes, the British had more that they could probably give the would-be Haitians, I guess.
For their part, we're well ahead of them. For years, representatives from Saint-Domingue had been petitioning the government to grant the free people of color full rights, and they too saw the revolution as an opportunity to further that goal. Originally, they had tried to get the big whites on their side, arguing that as fellow slaveholders, the two groups had interests in common. So give the free people of color rights, especially voting rights, and then the two groups together could form a political bloc to defend slavery. The big whites, though, weren't having it. They opposed any reform to the colony's racial caste system. So instead, the free people of color made an alliance with an abolitionist society called the Friends of the Blacks. And
they wouldn't want to change the big whites wouldn't want to change the existing system, because it's either they end up losing some enslaved people, or let's say they brought in the idea of slavery. What if they broadened it to the point where a white person could be enslaved? That would feel like an existential threat to the power structure as they know it. So there's really not much they'd be willing to budge on, I could imagine.
Argued that granting full rights to free people of color would be a major step on the road to gradual abolition. And here's where I'd like to pause for just a second, because this is the last time in this series where things will be relatively simple. Yeah, all of that stuff before was the simple part. Right after this point, both Saint-Domingue and France are going to use a technical historical term, go nuts. Everyone is going to ally with everyone else, and then change sides 15 minutes later. Legislatures are going to vote for reforms, dispatch messengers, dissolve, reform, and then reverse those reforms before the initial messengers even arrive. Revolutionary politics, in other words, is
clever.
about to resemble a bag full of cats on espresso. In fact, to even fit all of it into this series, we're going to have to gloss over the specifics of French revolutionary politics. Who's in, who's out, who's making policy, unless it has direct impact on Saint-Domingue. And we're also going to have to focus on important trends rather than the specific.
This level of autonomy that they want, it's really like the amount that this has in common with the American Revolution is kind of insane. And it's really not all that much overall that the powers that be in Haiti are asking for, or Saint-Domingue. You know, I guess I should use that term. I keep saying the would-be Haitians. They're asking for self-government, essentially. That's largely what the entire American Revolution was about. Just like there was the umbrella of the British king that the English government would be under, or any other established government that they have would be under that umbrella along with the Americans, but they would be independent of European parliaments or whatever. They just wanted it to be run by the Americans and the people who lived in these places that are being governed. And largely, that is one of the things that's being argued for here. One of the problems, though, it ends up being governed pretty much exclusively by the elite in the United States as well. It ends up being pretty much just governed by the elite, unless you had the money to have enough property that you could vote, or enough influence to the point where you could be in office. But there were such limitations on that nobody could. It was very difficult to rise from the lower class.
Specifics of who's allied with whom. And here's our first big trend. White colonials utterly refusing to implement moderate reforms. Both the big and small whites were so committed not just to the structure, but the principle of their racist status quo, that even a proposal like rights for free people of color, which affected roughly 5% of colonial society and essentially had no impact on them, was unacceptable. The second big trend to remember is the ideological flexibility of the free people of color, their ability to court different power blocks, and their sense that they had little in common with the enslaved. Both these dynamics are going to come up again and again. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was almost perfectly calculated to tear Saint-Domingue apart. Depending on how you read it, it could be used to either argue full rights for the people of color as well as the abolition of slavery, or you could claim, as the white colonials did, that it didn't mention slavery at all. But the big whites knew how explosive this was. They sent word back to the colony to prevent word from spreading. It didn't work. Revolutionary politics was all anyone talked about at the dinner table. Meanwhile, the enslaved people holding the trays and pouring the wine started to understand that cracks were forming in the system of oppression that bound them. In 1790, Vincent Auger, one of the free people of color's strongest advocates, returned to Saint-Domingue determined to cast a ballot in the new colonial elections. He believed that a piece of legislation passed earlier that year, giving all property owners a vote, made his case clear. He was a full citizen. When the governor refused, Auger sourced arms and staged an uprising. Now, the free people of color had long been the backbone of the colonial militia, an arduous and expensive duty many whites avoided. Some had even fought in the American Revolution. So
they didn't actually have like the real power to resist an uprising. This is one of those things. Power is, in a lot of ways, in most of its popular forms, like a made-up concept backed up by the threat of violence. And if you don't have the means to back up the threat of violence, where is the power in reality? It's wherever the guns actually are.
Drawing on this experience, Auger's force initially routed the local militias, but their success was short-lived. He only had 300 men, and a counterattack by regular troops sent him
thanks for joining us.
Into Spanish
Good to hear from you.
Domingo. He was extradited, tried, and broken on the wheel. But Auger's example inspired other revolts.
Broken on the wheel.
Tried and broken on the wheel.
I don't know actually how that works. Is that the thing where you break their neck? I actually don't know how that form of punishment really works. Like I've heard it, but I haven't actually had it like strongly described to me. It's just like that. Like I don't know.
But Auger's example inspired other revolts, not just among free people of color, but also isolated slave uprisings. The big whites refused to compromise, even though the rebels were not even demanding full emancipation. They wanted their leaders freed, an extra day off per week, and the abolition of whipping. Meanwhile, in France, Auger's death provided the Friends of the Blacks with new ammunition in the National Assembly. Here was a true revolutionary.
They martyred him.
As the political winds shifted, the big whites still refused to make concessions, even forcing the assembly to refer to the enslaved using the euphemism unfree persons.
Put on a wheel and they broke your bones. Sounds terrible. It's a really awful form of execution.
These hardline tactics backfired. Support for the free people of color, even emancipation, was increasingly held up as a test of a member's revolutionary ideals. And on May 15th, the National Assembly declared that free men of color, born to free parents, could both vote and be seated in assemblies. The big whites responded.
That's a game changer.
By going home and starting their own revolt. In June, big and small whites organized militias, and by July, they were seizing power centers, coming into violent conflict with government authorities, and organizing all-white assemblies. That is
This is kind of a common factor. Often the poor whites are turned against uh, like poor and working class black people. I guess there's also the element of the wealthy land owning black person thrown in here. But like, if poor working class white and black people ever really came together, like in the United States, it would be one of the biggest threats to the actual ruling elite that there's ever been. But they've always been somehow turned against one another. And often, poor white and black people, not white and black, poor and working class white people see them see like the existing of the power structure as a way of like holding them above the bottom place. Like at least they're always better than this group of people, whoever the demonized group of the time ends up being. So I don't know. I it's hard to get into their heads and understand it from our perspective now, but being not at the bottom was a big deal.
Issued decrees that all but declared themselves independent. They essentially decided that if they were to preserve white supremacy, they must govern themselves. That summer, the colonial whites fought government forces, and then they fought militias formed by the free people of color, who were furious about the all-white assemblies. Then, the colonial whites, along with government troops, engaged scattered slave uprisings. And in all of that internecine conflict, they were unable to see what was coming, because the long fuse of revolution was about to hit the powder keg. Now, one issue with studying the Haitian Revolution is that the enslaved, the faction that would eventually win, were largely illiterate and left few records. So, piecing together the specifics of the uprising, particularly its clandestine origins, takes a bit of detective work. What we do know is there had to have been months, if not years, of preparation. Likely those enslaved in houses, largely born in the colony and French-speaking, overheard conversations about the revolution and carried the news to others. Enslaved drivers and overseers, those with leadership roles, started organizing squads. In fact, the predominance of carriage drivers in revolutionary leadership suggests that they performed a major communication and intelligence role, passing messages between plantations. Then, the night came. August 14th, 1791. Duddy Bookman, voodoo priest, carriage driver, and rebel leader, holds a meeting at night on an open plain. Fires burn bright. A tropical storm rages in the distance. A good omen. Religious ceremonies like this are permitted on most plantations, and considered a healthy release valve, keeping insurrection at bay. Ironically, however, this summer, the enslaved have done the exact opposite, using the unsupervised gatherings to plan an uprising. And voodoo is the perfect medium of exchange, containing elements of various West African religions. It's one of the few cultural overlaps that the enslaved have, no matter where they were captured.
Is it really pronounced like that? I never hear it. Like, I'm not surprised that it's pronounced differently from how I've heard everybody else pronounce it. But you know, it's just standing out to me is all.
But this meeting is an emergency. A cell has triggered the uprising early, and upon capture, confessed everything. The plantation owners, thankfully, had not believed that the enslaved could organize on the level their captives described. According to tradition, Bookman and several priestesses extracted oaths and drank animal blood to seal a pact with the goddess of love. They swear to free themselves and free
Pretty
the land.
hardcore.
Then, they take up their cane knives and steady their souls.
They look like machetes.
Special thanks to our educational tier patrons, Ahmed.
So we're gonna go to part 3, so Fire and Freedom. So that would
August
put us at
22nd,
so this after this episode we're at the halfway point. So this is gonna be a long one, dude. Because like every bit is like super engaging.
1791. North Province, Saint-Domingue. A dog barks, waking the plantation manager. He tells the mutt to quiet down and drifts back to sleep. Minutes later, there's another noise. He rises and goes to the window, where he then sees that his house is surrounded by the plantation slaves, carrying machetes and torches. "Who goes there?" he calls. A voice like thunder answers. "It is death."
Oh, that's kind of badass. In Spanish, it's like voodoo. Yeah, I've only ever heard it pronounced voodoo, 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 voodoo. Now I feel like I'm saying it differently because now I'm thinking about how to say it. You know, like if if sometimes people will be like, how do people say blank where you're from? And then you're thinking about it too much and you can't think about how you say it when you're natural. I don't know if that's a thing other people do. That's kind of how I get sometimes. Like, how do we pronounce that? Now that I'm thinking about it too much, I can't tell what I would say naturally.
North, the cane fields burned so fierce that the smoke could be seen in Le Cap. The revolt had come with such precise timing and explosive force that it stunned the plantation owners and the French authorities. Indeed, it was so well planned that most of the various factions in Saint-Domingue thought that the enslaved couldn't possibly be the ringleaders, and they openly accused each other. White militias attacked and killed several free people of color, who they accused of masterminding the rebellion as revenge for the death of Auger. Plantation owners besieged the royal governor with requests for protection and ultimately accused him of intentionally letting the rebellion continue. The free people of color often said that it was actually the big whites who'd whipped up the rising as a way to take control of the colony. The irony, of course, was that all—
So they're basically arguing it's like a false flag operation. If we're going to be using modern terminology there, like they think that they are looking for an excuse to clamp down on the colony and create like stronger regulations or whatever, and they're using this as kind of an excuse. However, I'm sure they could find an excuse that's a little less of an actual threat.
All of these groups were pro-slavery, and if they had set their differences aside, they may have successfully repressed the uprising. But instead, the plantations burned. Rebel militias moved from plantation to plantation, liberating the enslaved and burning every physical representation of their oppression: cane fields, coffee plants, mills, and refineries. This also meant violence against the people who had oppressed them, and there were a number of overseers and plantation owners killed in retribution for centuries of oppression. Gangs of women found the plantation overseers who had coerced or assaulted them, beating their tormentors unconscious. But this rebellion was not indiscriminate. Most often, the rebels attacking a plantation had worked there, and it was common for men or women to step in and save an overseer thought to be a fair man, or to smuggle out women and children. In fact, the scene that started this episode comes from a first-hand account of the rebellion, and the reason that overseer lived to tell his story was that one of the rebels, a man who had been enslaved on that very plantation, stepped forward to demand the overseer's safety.
So, before we get there, it talks about the destruction of the slave society as we know it. Like a lot of the infrastructure is being burnt and destroyed. So when they succeed, they're still going to be left with a lot missing financially. How do they recover financially and live in a time of peace? Well, the answer might upset you, but slavery is going to be one of the big elements going forward. Just because the people with brown skin win doesn't mean that slavery is going to be outlawed.
Enslaved on that very plantation stepped forward to demand the overseer's safety. Who was that man? Duddy Bookman, who had triggered the rising with his ceremony. Propagandistic descriptions of the rising, sent back to France, claimed that thousands of white men, women, and children were killed in the initial rebellion. While this image has stuck, it's inaccurate. A commission at the time counted 400 whites dead in the first 4 months, including those killed trying to put down the uprising. The toll on the rebels ran much higher. Most of them were armed with only machetes and agricultural tools. Only 1 in 5 had a firearm. But they did have other advantages. Many had been sold into slavery as prisoners of war. Veterans of tribal conflicts.
So they were fighters.
Warfare. Their raids, heralded with the blast of a conch shell, became infamous among their enemies. Even professional soldiers marveled at the rebels' bravery in the face of the superior firepower. Due to a belief that the spirits of those killed returned to Africa, they attacked with a relentless courage, literally throwing themselves on cannons, jamming their arms into barrels and wheel spokes so the guns could not be reloaded or withdrawn. They suffered terrible casualties in pitched battles. 4,000 died in the August Rising alone, roughly 10 for every enemy killed. But they didn't lose morale. They did, however, start losing commanders. Bookman was killed in early November. Infighting claimed others. And as the first set of leaders fell and factions splintered, the violence grew worse. All sides committed massacres. To approach Le Cap, one of the richest cities in the colony, meant passing a wall of heads on stakes, including Bookman. But amidst the swelling chaos, new leaders rose. In the western province, near the city of
It's your
Port-au-Prince,
boy.
a separate uprising was happening among the free people of color. There, they managed to sign a treaty.
Like, I'm surprised we've gotten this far and not really talked about Toussaint. I actually thought we would have addressed him a little bit more so far. But we're alluding to him now, so we're going to be getting there.
With many rural plantation owners, recognizing their shared interests as property and slave owners. They dismissed their all-white governments and installed representatives of both groups instead. After all, the National Assembly had made them free citizens with the May 15th decree. They were only good revolutionary patriots following the law. Those big and small whites in Le Cap and Port-au-Prince, they were the counter-revolutionary royalist traitors talking about independence. Except then a messenger came with the news that there had been a change in power, and the National Assembly had changed its mind. The May 15th decree, making a small number of free people of color full citizens, had been repealed. The plantation owners' rebellion had made the assembly gun-shy, worried that they'd upset an economy that was helped propping up French finances. This alliance with the whites was not to last. In November, after a long siege, the army of the free people of color finally entered the provincial capital of Port-au-Prince. Once inside, though, the treaty broke down, as a personal brawl between one of the little whites and a free man of color descended into street fighting that burned 27 square blocks of the city. The alliance was dead. This same thing will happen basically every time the whites and the free people of color try to form an alliance. Everything will be agreed between the plantation-owning big whites and the free people of color, and then the small whites will come along and muck it up. And this is when one of the key figures of the revolution emerged, a free black man named Toussaint Louverture. Louverture's background, including any early involvement in the uprisings, is a bit mysterious. He was born in slavery, but gained freedom long before 1791, staying to help manage the plantation where his family was still enslaved. He was also unusual in that he had no white ancestry, like most free people of color, and owned no property. Perhaps this fact, the sense that he was of two worlds, was why he was chosen to broker peace between the big whites and the black rebels in the northern province. Because you see, by late November, it was a stalemate. The rebel army held much of the countryside, but the whites and government forces controlled the cities. In addition, a commission had just arrived from France with news that the country had a new constitution, one that granted amnesty for actions committed during the initial revolution. Louverture helped the rebel generals then carried them.
Louverture. That's a name that I always struggled with reading. I never knew how to pronounce that. I don't even know if he's doing it right. I can't say, but like it still doesn't feel right.
To the big whites, and get this, here are the terms that the generals of the rebellion offered. The enslaved would return to the plantations, and the generals would get freed. Yeah, you heard that right. The leaders go free, and everyone else goes back into slavery. See, here's another major theme to keep your finger on. Over and over again, we'll see the leaders of the Haitian Revolution make decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of the movement. Now it's unclear if the generals could even have gotten their troops to accept these terms, but we'll never know. Because the big whites, once again, completely refused to compromise, rejecting even these terms.
Yeah, it might not have been even possible, so refusing might have, like, maybe they would refuse from a pragmatic standpoint where they don't think, like, things are that's gonna work out either way. But that's like a darn good deal if they were able to make for the big whites. Like, that would have been considered a pretty darn good deal. So the inability to bend is kind of insane here, unless it is from the perspective of, yeah, we know you can't actually promise that, but so I don't know if that's actually the case or not.
The only winner was Louverture, who gained major respect among the generals. In fact, he was soon one of them, a fellow general in the rebellion. And like many of the other generals, both of the rebels and the free people of color, he settled into living in a large house, giving orders in the little jigsaw piece of the north he controlled. And
no, he is not pronouncing that right. I thought not, but like it's a hard name to pronounce. Let's just be fair. Like, I still don't know how to say it right.
That's when Louverture began showing himself to be an exceptionally able
It's a tough name.
On the battlefield, he brought an organization and discipline to his forces that was previously missing in the rebel armies. And his political talents, too, were exceptional. He was excellent at striking compromise, bringing opposing sides together, and finding a situation all could live with. While the fighting was at a low ebb and in control of the countryside, the rebels went about creating a black society, with black leaders, courts, and administrations. Which is incredible when you think that they had just been enslaved months before. But this was also a society headed by military officers, with peasants farming whatever land they could. To buy weapons from Spanish Santo Domingo, the generals often forced people to grow sugar on the old plantations, and, at times, even sold subordinates into slavery, a practice Louverture refused to take part in, because the revolution to this point was about better working conditions and more power, rather than abolitionism. But that would soon change, because a ship was coming. On it were several commissioners from France, carrying a newly signed law granting full civil and political rights to the free people of color in the colonies. Oh, that's right. The government had reversed itself again, going from some free people of color having rights to none to then everyone, all in about 4 months. But the commission also carried orders to crush the white extremist dreams of independence, integrate the local assemblies, and end the slave insurrection. They came with 6,000 soldiers. But they would need more, because within 6 months of the commission's arrival, other ships would be arriving in Saint-Domingue, ships from Britain and Spain. France was at war, and the war in Saint-Domingue was going international.
Brady, pronounce. Oh, is this a pronunciation challenge? I'll take it on. Like, I'll try. I'm going to say this slowly. King Sri Parakrama Naranthasingha. I'm gonna add some phlegm at the end where it probably doesn't belong. Yeah, I don't know. I am the worst at pronouncing things. I'm the last person who's gonna make fun of anybody for pronouncing something incorrectly. So you can kind of probably see what I meant by, like, this is kind of a conservative revolution, as in it's not upending the power structure entirely. There are some things that they're aiming to change, but there's also, like, this large group that's trying to maintain the slave structure. That is one of those things that would be considered more conservative here. But there's little changes going in. It is trying to sort of alter the position of the more wealthy black people. But overall, it does come off as somewhat of a conservative revolution. It's still keeping a very similar power structure in place, a similar class divide.
Special thanks to our educational tier patrons Ahmed Ziad Turk, Joseph Blame, and Dominic Valenciana.
All right. So we've passed the halfway, or we are on the halfway point here. So we have liberation, liberacion. I don't know what language that was. Not bad. My pronunciation wasn't too bad. Okay. Considering I have no idea what the language actually sounds like where you're from, like, that's the best I could go with.
Saint-Domingue, September 1792. 2 men arrive from France. They're here to address the question of rights for the free people of color. It is the second commission, the first group having carried a completely different message. But this group makes their intentions clear when they land. They're here to ensure the free people of color receive full rights, as French law now requires. They will radically integrate the assemblies, and they've brought 6,000 troops to make sure that everyone, rebellious slaves and big whites alike, stay in line. To tamp down the murmurings amongst the big whites, they say their orders do not include the abolition of slavery. They're here to save slavery, they say, not end it. But end it is exactly what this second commission will end up doing. And their 6,000 troops, they'll not nearly be enough.
I actually have no idea what's going on right now. Like, I know what's going on, but I don't know where this is going from here. I actually knew an okay amount of that stuff leading up to this point, but I'm not sure what twists and turns lie at this stage. So this is probably going to be all new to me.
Despite assurances, the white population of Saint-Domingue feared the commissioners were secretly working toward emancipation. And there was a reason for that. Both commissioners were known abolitionists, and the big and small whites made the decision to refuse to work with the commission, comply with their laws, or even help them fight the rebellion. The free people of color, though, were only too happy to show their loyalty to the commission. Soon, the free people of color and French troops were fighting side by side, making great progress against both white separatists and black rebels. Which was good, because roughly 5 minutes after the commission got to the colony, yellow fever turned their 6,000 reinforcements into 3,000. But this alliance only deepened suspicions that the commissioners meant to end slavery, suspicions that boiled over when the commission issued a decree that they were reinstituting the long-ignored Code Noir, a set of regulations governing the treatment of the enslaved, from providing proper food, clothing, and housing, to opening channels the enslaved could use to report abuse. This was the last straw for the big whites. They had already been buddying up to the new governor, a pro-slavery plantation owner like them, and soon he was insulting the commission and threatening to counteract their decrees. So, the commissioners, deciding that this constituted rebellion, marched into Le Cap and imprisoned the governor. Except he escaped, and all hell broke loose. The governor rallied his troops and attacked Le Cap, where the commissioners and soldiers were now based, besieging and taking the city. But during the fight, fires ignited the colonial port, burning down most of the city's grand Paris-style buildings, operas, and boulevards. The commissioners themselves ended up outside of the city and needing reinforcements. Worse still, both Spain and Britain had declared war on France, so the Spanish got busy sponsoring and fighting alongside rebels like Toussaint Louverture, while word was a British force was already on the way. The commission needed troops fast. So they did something unorthodox, maybe out of desperation, or maybe because they saw an opening for a move they wanted to make anyway. They put the word out that any formerly enslaved person who fought for them would gain their freedom and full French citizenship. Rebels thronged in from the countryside to join their forces, and they pushed the big whites and their allied governor out of Le Cap. Over half of the colony's white population boarded boats and fled overnight. But now agreeing to free a few people with conditions let the genie out of the bottle. All
right, guys, let me step into the chat argument here. Just Google it. I don't know. Like, maybe the word means the same thing in Spanish and French. Maybe it just sounds the same. Maybe you're both right. I don't know. And not to take a 50-50 thing here, but you both clearly have a computer, so somebody's not Googling it.
Saint-Domingue's formerly enslaved population heard that emancipation was in fact on the table. Rumors of abolition raced across the North Province, and on August 29, 1793, the commissioners took the leap. Pressed by the rebels, Spain and Britain,
glad you worked it out.
Slipping away, they did the one thing that they believed could turn the tide: a general emancipation. All former slaves born in the colony, along with their families, would be freed. Yet while this news was greeted with enthusiasm in the
little foot tap animation.
Not all the rebels came to the commission's aid. Toussaint Louverture and many other generals were skeptical of whether this promise of freedom would hold. After all, the commission was exceeding their authority. Indeed, they'd even gotten a recall order due to their actions, and the last colonial governor who'd overstepped had been recalled to France and guillotined. Also, this Republican French government had already become infamous for changing its mind. Because remember last episode, when the free people of color had rights, and then they didn't, and then they did again? Yeah,
they don't again.
The rebels remembered that too. Not to mention previous trades of freedom for military service had also gone badly. And Louverture, along with these other generals, had a more consistent ally, a rival power, who owned the western half of the island: Spain. In fact, though Spanish troops had only crossed the border recently, Spain had covertly supported the slave rebellion since its earliest days. But now with open war declared, Louverture's forces were receiving arms, ammunition, and even uniforms from the Spanish. And that alliance with Spain did seem more suited to Louverture. After all, Spain had not promised them liberation. It offered to recognize that the enslaved had liberated themselves. Spanish political policies, too, lined up with the rebels. Because most of the rebels were royalists, who, due to incorrect rumors, believed King Louis was pro-emancipation. They disliked revolutionary ideas.
That's one of the big issues. There's a lot of miscommunications that can occur across an ocean. Always to tie it back to the American Revolution, because it's what I know. A lot of Americans leading up to the American Revolution believed that King George III was on their side, and that Parliament was overstepping his like they were defying his authority by trying to regulate the colonies, even though King George III was totally cool with it. Like they created like this idealized version of the king that was somehow an American revolutionary. They figured it out later on that maybe he wasn't as on their side as they thought, but it's amazing how many misunderstandings can occur when you're an ocean away and communication is as slow as it is.
And symbols, mostly because their enemies, the small whites and the free people of color, had enthusiastically adopted them. Not to mention, Republican France was making moves on religion, suppressing the Catholic Church and replacing it with their own secular variant. And most of the rebels found that deeply offensive. Yeah, that's a wild story actually, and we'll get to it, one day. But there were also cracks forming in this Spanish alliance as well. First of all, the war in Europe had turned, and Republican France suddenly looked like it might win. Second, the big whites who'd evacuated to Barbados had convinced the British to invade, under the specific promise of restoring slavery and racial apartheid. Wherever the Royal Navy landed ships and took ports, they put everyone right back in bondage. So technically, this alliance with the Spanish put the rebels on the same side as the British-aligned plantation owners, and Louverture knew this was not sustainable. See, he had advantages that other rebel generals...
This is indeed a mess.
Louverture was literate, had briefly owned a farm with slaves, and he had been in plantation management. This meant that not only could he keep up correspondence with allies, but he had also long practiced navigating white society. Now sure, the Spanish had other rebel allies, but Louverture kept up a lively correspondence. And actually not just with his allies, but with his French enemies as well. This would become a hallmark of Louverture's strategy. A savvy politician, he would always seek favor from all sides, and his vision of the colony.
So he tried to connect with the Americans as well. This is one of the big stories that I found really interesting about the Adams administration. While Thomas Jefferson is not going to be a huge fan of a bunch of black people rising up against their European masters, I wonder why. John Adams actually at least initiated conversation with Toussaint, though I don't think anything ever came of it.
Always consisted of integrating the island's black, white, and free people of colored population into a single society. But he was not naive. He knew that the freedom the Spanish were promising was at odds with the revived slave system the British were offering the big whites, and he saw Spain's commitment to racial equality wavering. As both news and the rhetoric of abolition crept across Saint-Domingue, both his political ideas about general emancipation and his political calculus began to shift. Because the revolution was beginning to craft its end goal, a thing that had been nebulous and confused up to this point: the complete abolition of slavery. Also, the French were eager for Louverture to defect. Despite having no military experience before the rebellion, he had blossomed into one of the most able commanders of the conflict. When he captured European officers, he treated them well and had them instruct his men. He ensured they operated like a modern military, but also kept one foot in the guerrilla tactics that had served the rebellion so well.
Of course.
And he had the most important strategic position in the colony, garrisoning a line of forts that separated the rebel
guerrilla tactics just make sense in the Americas. It just works. It has historically worked very well over here. So, and in revolution in general, you're typically kind of forced to rely heavily on guerrilla tactics. You can't just put all your soldiers in a line and expect them to be a much larger foe. You got to use your environment. You've got to be sneaky. You got to be faster than them because you're a small force. Therefore, you can typically move faster than a much larger force. So, like, in general, like, guerrilla tactics generally made more sense during this time.
Held North Province from the French-held South and West. He had effectively split the French force, the commissioners in the north and the free colored troops in the south. Then, something incredible happened. In February of 1794, representatives of the colony spoke before the National Convention on the issue of slavery. It was a tricolor commission, consisting of one of the big whites, a free black army officer, and a free person of color. They argued that emancipation was the only way to keep control of the vital economic engine of Saint-Domingue. Not to mention, it was also the purest expression of Republican principles. They got more than they bargained for. Not only did the National Convention end slavery in Saint-Domingue, they ended slavery in all French colonies. Moreover, they declared that all men living in France and its possessions, regardless of the color of their skin, were full citizens and protected by the Constitution. Upon hearing that the French had actually fulfilled their promise of emancipation,
that is just a game changer right there. You gotta acknowledge that is a total game changer.
Louverture ditched his Spanish allies and switched sides. He now had the largest and most professional force in the colony, allies that aligned with his—
Hold on a second. Where was my— There we go. I haven't had my music on this whole time. I love my music. I had this music made and I haven't been using it this whole time. No, we're doing the music now. Ha.
Political goals, a strategic position to fight both the Spanish and British, and the backing of a major power. By 1795, Spain was knocked out of the war, ceding their side of the island to France. British troops were dying in droves of yellow fever, with 30,000 more on the way to help end the war. Yet it would do no good. The time of the European powers in Haiti was waning, and the rebel generals would instead turn on each other. For the war of muskets and uniforms was over, and the war of knives had begun.
Yo.
Special thanks to our educational tier patrons Ahmed Ziad Turk, Joseph Blame, and Dominic Valenciana.
All right, let's go to number 5. Let's do it.
1796. The British soldiers come ashore and die. Come ashore and die. One of the largest expeditions to this point in British history. 20,000 men and thousands of German mercenaries disembark. Within 4 months, most are cut down by yellow fever. Back in Britain, troops riot upon the announcement of a deployment to Saint-Domingue. British forces end up hiring 7,000 black mercenaries to fight for them. Some reports will claim that 60% of the British expedition, 15,000 men, will die. And those that make it to the interior of the island find something frightening. The troops of Brigadier General Toussaint Louverture and his ally André Rigaud fighting like professional soldiers. They do, after all, have years of combat experience. But soon, instead of fighting the British, they will fight each other. With general emancipation declared and the departure of the Spanish, things started to level out for Toussaint. Not calm down necessarily. I mean, he was still fighting. But with the British pinned to the coast and rivals fighting low-intensity conflicts, he could turn to actually governing. He was in control of the North Province, while his ally and rival, André Rigaud, a free person of color who'd long taken part in the group's insurrection, controlled the South. Thus, the colony was essentially divided into 2 rival administrative centers that would ultimately come to blows in what would be known as the War of Knives. But in 1793,
I know that term,
was consolidation. Finally, Toussaint had a chance to enact his vision for an integrated post-slavery society, one that brought the white, free people of color, and black populations into a peaceful, functioning whole, which would prove difficult. Part of that difficulty was that Saint-Domingue's economy was dysfunctional by design. France had wanted the colonists to be dependent on France, and had therefore restricted industry, to the point that the island was solely focused on producing sugar, coffee, and indigo. It was restricted from making any moves that might make it self-sufficient. In fact, it had to import food to sustain its population. So the only system that worked was to continue producing sugar, coffee, and indigo. But a few problems there. First,
they need the
destruction
workforce.
of the plantation infrastructure early in the revolution meant that major rebuilding would need to take place. Second, many of those plantations still had living owners, many of them refugees, and could not simply be given away under French law. They had to be managed in trust. And finally, no one wanted to go back to doing the same awful work they'd been forced to do when they were enslaved. But Toussaint and Rigaud solved that last situation using the same means everyone in this conflict always used: military force. They used troops to force people back onto the plantations. Now, this was not slavery. It was forced work. The difference being that the workers were paid, physical punishment was forbidden, and no one's spouse or children were getting sold away. They also had rights and protection.
Like, it's not the biggest distinction, because it does still have some of the major things in slavery that would that we would be against on the face of it. Forced work being one of the bigger, more obvious elements that one would complain about when it comes to slavery as a system. So virtually, I don't know if this is like some sort of like twisted serfdom, because it's a little different from a lot of systems of serfdom. I'm not as big in, maybe this is based on one that did exist at one point. I don't know if this is grounded in any sort of history, but like it's still objectionable.
As citizens, including the right to legally marry. This is a stain on Toussaint's legacy, as were the violent repressions he unleashed on those who rose against this forced labor program. But in Toussaint's estimation, this, and other autocratic actions he would take, were necessary to guard the freedoms that they had won. He knew that
he lived long enough to become a villain, Toussaint
would be seen as a test case for abolitionism, and what happened there would send a message across the world about whether freed slaves could not only be integrated into a wider society, but could build and sustain their own government. If Saint-Domingue collapsed, not only might slavery return, in fact there were big whites in Paris advocating for just that, but opponents would draw the conclusion that abolition had been a mistake, and such a determination would have global consequences. And Toussaint increasingly believed he was the only one that could secure the revolution and the freedoms they'd won. As he fought the British,
that's a cool flag, man.
Growing, he began to edge out political rivals, even allies. When one long time...
Okay, it's a cool flag, but like, how could you make that and not think you look like the bad guy? It's one of those like super villain looking flags. I don't know. Black and red, it just looks evil.
His power growing, he began to edge out political rivals, even allies. When one longtime rival rebelled and captured the colony's governor, accusing him of trying to reinstate slavery, Toussaint rescued the man and got named lieutenant governor for the service. During the election for the colony's representatives in France, Toussaint steered his rival to victory.
Though before I continue, though I could probably see where some of the inspiration for that flag comes from, and I'm sure poetically it makes sense. It just has the it has the unfortunate color scheme of like all the biggest like villain flags of history. Yeah.
So that then they would be forced to live in France, far from his developing power center. He would get himself declared Governor General shortly afterward. And in 1798, he started conducting his own diplomacy. He concluded a secret peace with the British, where they would withdraw their troops and naval blockade from Saint-Domingue in exchange for the return of French royalists and a promise that Toussaint would not export the uprising to Barbados. That concluded, he sent a representative to the United States, striking a deal with John Adams so the undeclared naval war between the US and France would not affect trade with Saint-Domingue. Because you see, another running theme to think about, and you're keeping track of all of these, right? Was that Saint-Domingue was always a piece in a larger game. The United States was right next door, as was British Barbados, and France supported whatever leader, in their estimation, best served their interests. And that interplay of various powers sponsoring or intervening in the island's affairs will become a major part of Haitian history all the way to present day. In other words, Toussaint was increasingly behaving like the leader of an independent nation, though he did so with the veneer of French support. He was, after all, a brigadier general of the Republic, and would remain so as long as the French upheld their abolition of slavery. In fact, Toussaint had essentially ejected the previous governor. Meanwhile, relationships between Toussaint and Rigaud began to sour, partially due to that expelled governor playing political games about which one was higher ranking, and partially due to the fact that they both wanted total control. Soon, Rigaud appealed to France, casting himself as the loyal revolutionary, and Toussaint as a dictatorial usurper who wanted independence. Toussaint
does look very evil with those sharp teeth.
Rigaud planned to reimpose slavery, a slander Rigaud turned back on him. Of course, neither wanted that, but there were factions on both sides willing to believe it. Toussaint had invited back many plantation owners in order to rebuild the economy, so it seemed plausible from that angle. And Rigaud had rebuilt the southern province with a caste system with the free people of color on top. So again, people could imagine it. Both leaders had alienated supporters with their forced work policies, and those alienated groups started believing that the other leader would never treat them like that. And both accused the other of perpetrating a race war, even though there were representatives of all of the island's groups on both sides. Strip away the rhetoric, though, and this was a struggle between two leaders for supremacy. On June 6, 1799, Rigaud sent 4,000 troops to seize several border towns and negotiate the defection of one of Toussaint's veteran regiments. The act triggered a small uprising in Toussaint's northern territory, and he dodged two assassination attempts. In one, Toussaint had his hat shot off and an aide killed. In another, his carriage was peppered with a volley of bullets, though by pure chance, he was not inside. Thus began a civil war that would come to be known as the War of Knives. And it earned that
Yay!
title.
The War of Knives,
Both
finally.
sides offered no quarter, and prisoners, when taken at all, rarely lasted long. At the outset of the conflict, Rigaud's forces, better trained and equipped, made quick gains against Toussaint. But the northern general had an enormous numerical advantage, and the increasingly open support of the United States. Not only were the Americans shipping Toussaint arms, at times.
So something did come of that. So this would have happened under the Adams administration. I talked about this earlier, that John Adams was in contact with Toussaint, which is really interesting because, like, Thomas Jefferson's gonna get elected shortly after this, but Adams is still in office, so he must have made the call to actually do something with that. That's actually really interesting.
The United States Navy intervened directly, providing fire support during sieges and blockading ports. The American consul even issued passports to Toussaint's ships, allowing them to pass the blockade when Rigaud's ships could not. And during this vicious fighting, one of Toussaint's commanders rose to prominence, Brigadier General Jacques Dessalines, a former slave who had fought through the Revolution and who was known for massacring prisoners and rebels with such vindictiveness that Toussaint censored him for it. Though in fact, it is possible Toussaint actually ordered these reprisal killings, using Dessalines as a willing scapegoat to avoid ruining his carefully crafted image of generosity and kindness. The war ground to a stalemate. Rigaud besieged and pinned, but Toussaint, unwilling to expend the casualties necessary to dislodge him. And then, another commission arrived from France. Yeah, another one, announcing another change in government. General Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the political system and declared
he's on the
himself
scene
lost.
now.
His message? To reaffirm that in the eyes of France, Toussaint was the leader of Saint-Domingue. The war ended basically overnight, with Toussaint allowing Rigaud to slip away into exile in France, which left Toussaint free to invade Santo Domingo. While technically still French, was still administered by the Spanish. He claimed it was to prevent his free citizens from getting kidnapped and sold into slavery there, but it may have actually been a bid to bolster his forces through liberation and control all of the island's ports. Because Napoleon's representatives also brought word of a new constitution, one that rescinded the idea that colonies should have the same laws as France.
Oh,
Instead,
jeez.
they would have special laws, tailored to their unique conditions. In other words, Napoleon planned to bring back slavery. In response, Toussaint wrote his own constitution, his own special laws, stating that Saint-Domingue was a sovereign black state, one that rejected slavery outright, and one
That's pretty badass. Okay, I'm actually very excited for this next episode.
where he was governor for life.
Governor for life, oh
declared
god.
independence, and then prepared for invasion.
So Toussaint's he's very ego-driven. I guess you don't get as far as he has without having an ego problem. I've always said that presidents and kings or whatever are a bunch of like either sociopaths or narcissists. It takes a certain level of self-importance to get as far as a lot of them do in life, and often the conditions of the position make it worse. Yeah.
January 1802, Le Cap. 20,000 French soldiers arrive off the coast of Saint-Domingue. For months, Toussaint Louverture has sent letters to Napoleon telling him that the only way for Saint-Domingue to stay a part of France is home rule, a system where slavery can never return. Toussaint has not broken the colony from France, he argues. He has saved it. Napoleon feels differently. He has sent
he
his
gonna be
force
mad.
under the command of his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, with orders to subjugate the island and arrest Toussaint, because he fundamentally believes Toussaint's government should not exist. My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue, Napoleon said, is not so much based on consideration of commerce and money, as on the need to block forever the march of blacks in the world.
What kind of accent is that? It seems like vaguely Irish almost.
The authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue, Napoleon said, is not so much based on consideration of commerce and money, as on the need to block forever the march of blacks in the world. And in
That's a
that
weird voice to
endeavor,
give Napoleon.
he will fail.
I think they were going for like French speaking English, but something about that sounded a little bit a little bit Irish to me, honestly.
Toussaint Louverture's Constitution of 1801 was a landmark in world history. Not only did it state that slavery would never be allowed in Saint-Domingue, it made Haiti the first nation in the world whose constitution forbade discrimination on the basis of race and skin color. It's an incredible document, and many nations will spend a century and a half catching up to those same ideals. But it also effectively gave the colony home rule. And not only did this, let's just say, upset France, it also made Toussaint's allies reconsider supporting him. The British were briefly at peace with France and no longer wanted to rock the boat. And the new president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, was a staunchly pro-French slave owner. He was not going to support a government formed via slave revolt. In fact, both nations were...
It's amazing. Thomas Jefferson loved revolution no matter what, except if it was black people. Oh, God. This is why it's so hard to like Thomas Jefferson, but it's interesting. Like, I think everybody who studies American history goes through like these peaks and valleys with Thomas Jefferson, because you want to like him when you're a student, because there's a lot of things, like he's like this pretentious Renaissance man that people want to see themselves in a lot of ways. Like, he's both I guess he's both an elite and not at the same time. Like, he puts on this like everyman thing while at the same time being an elite. I guess anybody could read whatever they want into a lot of elements of Thomas Jefferson, but then like there comes a point where you start to realize he's totally full of it. And then where Thomas Jefferson falls from there, you could like come to terms with who he is as a flawed figure, or you could be like, yeah, he's totally overrated or whatever, or he was just a liar. Whatever determination you come to, that's up to you. But like, there's a time when I really wanted to like Thomas Jefferson. He was one of the first historical figures that I cared about.
He was not going to support a government formed via slave revolt. In fact, both nations were so concerned that the revolution might spread to their own slave systems that they began turning away refugees that might even carry news of it. There was an idea developing that this troublesome island that had proven slave insurrection could not only win, but then fight off incursions by multiple European armies would set a bad precedent if it succeeded. Besides, the country's sugar infrastructure had been so damaged by the years of fighting that the main economic argument that independence was good for foreign trade no longer held water. 15% of Saint-Domingue's workforce had left the plantations to join rebel or foreign armies. Factory workers in cities had been repeatedly damaged. And then Leclerc arrived. Originally, his orders were to negotiate a peaceful solution, but that went out the window when one of his commanders attacked a fort due to a miscommunication. Now it was war. Toussaint's defensive plan was to withdraw into the mountainous interior for a guerrilla war, torching the cities so the French had no base of operations. Experience taught him that these new arrivals would suffer badly from disease, and that would be his advantage. But 2 months before Leclerc arrived, Toussaint was forced to put down a rebellion, led by his adopted nephew, who had never been fully on board with the forced labor program. Soon, Leclerc secured the Santo Domingo side. Had Toussaint been able to marshal a united island, he would have won outright. But the recent civil strife and garbled communications meant that many did not rally to his banner. Even so, initial battles stunned both sides with their ferocity. Toussaint decided against raising the cities, but one of his commanders did put Le Cap to the torch before withdrawing. Both sides were in bad shape. Yellow fever swept through the French ranks, and the guerrilla campaign caused heavy casualties. So 5 months into the war, when Leclerc offered peace, in exchange for Toussaint retiring to his plantation with Toussaint decided that it was his best option. He could not continue. It was there the French troops arrested him. Instead of treating him like an officer of rank, they bundled him along like a prisoner, musket at his back, putting him on a ship and deporting him to France. In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the Tree of Liberty, Toussaint warned.
Okay, this sounds kind of like George Takei. Like a little bit. We got some interesting voices coming out in this one.
You have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the Tree of Liberty, Toussaint warned during the arrest. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are numerous and they are deep. He would die less than a year later, malnourished and ill, in a mountain castle. But his words proved prophetic. Leclerc had taken nominal control, having brought with him André Rigaud and other exiles that had fled Toussaint, and had mostly convinced the population that France did not intend to bring back slavery. But then, France brought back slavery in nearby Guadeloupe, and residents of Saint-Domingue knew it was only a matter of time before it happened to them. This was the universal call to arms Toussaint could not raise. No one wanted slavery back. Local officers that had supported Leclerc defected, and one group massacred several hundred Polish troops who were part of the French expedition. So, Leclerc decided on a new tactic: utter brutality. He wrote to Napoleon, saying that he would exterminate the rebels in the mountain areas, sparing only children under age 12. He would execute all black military officers. French soldiers shot and bayoneted prisoners by the hundreds. He executed 1,000 people by tying weights around their necks and throwing them off ships. And Jacques Dessalines, now in nominal control of local forces, responded in kind. The violence of the conflict only escalated further when Leclerc himself died of yellow fever, leaving in charge an even more brutal subordinate who imported man-eating dogs to deal with the rebels. But this only galvanized the black and colored armies to finally form a united force. A year later, a year where Dessalines handed the French defeat after defeat, both sides gathered for what would be a decisive battle. The French held a hill fort, and General Francois Capua, a man who had risen up the ranks to become a general and was known as Capua the Death, sounded the charge. French cannons tore into their ranks. Capua and his soldiers clambered over the casualties, regrouping when broken, reforming and pushing on. On the fourth assault, Capua tumbled to earth, his horse mutilated by a cannonball. He rose, and a bullet snatched away his hat. Then he drew his sword and ran in front of his men, yelling, "Forward! Forward!" The display was so incredible, the French stopped firing and applauded his bravery. A French officer rode forward to carry the general's compliments. After this weird little aside, then the fighting resumed. Rebel generals serving in the front line were wounded. Shots tore away pieces of their uniforms. Still, they attacked. Then, the revolution ended as it began, with a storm. Lightning rent the air, and water poured down. The French withdrew.
I love when God gets involved.
They sent a peace envoy the next day to negotiate their withdrawal from the island. Of the 80,000 French troops sent to Saint-Domingue, only 30,000 would return. In fact, their withdrawal...
There's something wrong with these numbers.
Troops sent to Saint-Domingue, only 30,000 would return. In fact,
with all the
was
zeros?
Part of a general French pullback from the Americas. The vast expenditures of blood and treasure in Saint-Domingue convinced Napoleon to cut his losses and focus on his European wars. To help that pursuit, he sold Louisiana to the United States. Dessalines was supposed to send the French wounded back to France.
And we talked about the Louisiana Purchase a little bit last time with the You Are There episode that we checked out. If any of you were there for that, the audio was messed up, but I did do an updated version of that where I meticulously added in new audio to just basically remaster that segment. So that's up on the channel as like a separate upload. So if any of you only saw the crap version, there's a good version now. There. So that's a thing.
After Leclerc's withdrawal, he drowned them instead. Because Dessalines...
There was more zeros than there should have been for like 80,000. Like after the comma, there's supposed to be 3 zeros, but there was 4 zeros. So that kind of threw me off.
Had learned something from all of those years of indecision around slavery. With its wild reversals over civil rights and abolition, with French citizens like the Big Whites constantly trying to undermine and reverse every freedom won, the French had sent a message over the past decade that the people of Saint-Domingue would never be safe under the rule of white Frenchmen. So, after declaring the island to be the independent nation of Haiti, Dessalines ordered all remaining white French should be massacred, even the women and children. The people were reluctant, and often only complied when Dessalines showed up with an army to enforce the edict. Some French escaped, pretending to be Americans or British, who were not subject to the decree. But the message Dessalines intended to send backfired. It further isolated Haiti, with the United States refusing to recognize its government or trade with it for 60 years. Dessalines' military rule, and crowning himself emperor, continued to set the new nation on a troubled path. Generals would seize power regularly, ensuring the new nation could never fully recover from the damage of the revolution. Slaveholding societies like the United States looked at Haiti as a nightmare scenario, using it to argue incorrectly that wholesale slaughter was the inevitable result of abolition, and that a black nation could not govern itself. Later, the French returned, forcing the Haitian government into massive indemnity payments it couldn't afford, burdening the already broken economy, keeping it in poverty. And due to this political instability, the United States would stage multiple military interventions in the 19th and 20th centuries under the banner of protecting American lives and property, eventually occupying the nation for 19 years. Others saw a different message, one of inspiration, not fear. When American firebrand John Brown tried to raise a slave revolt in the South before the Civil War, he'd hoped to trigger an uprising like Haiti's.
Your boy John
and
Brown.
The new nation would both harbor the revolutionary Simon Bolivar when he was a fugitive and loan him Haitian troops on the condition that he freed the slaves in Spanish America.
There's a lot of
colonized
interconnectedness
Haiti
here.
would become a symbol, one that showed what was possible when people, despite having nothing but determination and a desire for freedom, declared they would be slaves no more. Special thanks to our tier patrons Ahmed Ziad Turk,
That was
Joseph
sick.
Blake, and Dominic Valenciana.
That was a really good one. I really enjoyed that, and it's a subject that I've always wanted to explore more, but never got around to. That was a big one for me. I'm really glad that we finally got around to doing that.